Hello everyone. Today's topic is best practices for in-home assessments. So I want to make this very, very clear, and I'm going to use an analogy in order to make this point. If you are concerned about your child juggling, I know juggling is not really a behavior, but I'm using this analogy. So if your concern is that your child juggles, it is really important at your in-home assessment that the social worker, if it's possible, sees your child juggling. If in fact that's not something that occurs, you need to show your social worker in some of the documents that at some point your child has either been observed to juggle or your child has been reported to have juggled in reports. It's really important that you be able to corroborate whatever your concerns are at the in-home assessment. And so today we're going to talk about ways that you can more effectively make it so that you can demonstrate that your child juggles. And once again, that's an analogy. First thing I want to state about the in-home assessment is that it's important that the social worker sees your child in a typical setting, and that the setting is not, for one reason or another, distorted so that it's easier for your social worker to conduct their assessment. One of the things that I commonly see in assessments is I see social workers attempting to engage a child and then turning on a television, or perhaps maybe asking the parents to give the child a phone or maybe a tablet in order to make the assessment easier for the social worker in terms of asking questions of the parent. But what's really important is the social worker sees your child in a setting that is typical of the concerns you have for protective supervision. So as I stated before, if in fact your concern for your child is juggling, it's really important that if you have the ability to have your child juggle in front of the social worker, you make it possible for your child to juggle in front of the social worker. You also want to have your docs ready. You want to have copies of your documentation for the social worker. It makes things much, much easier for the process. The types of documentation that you should have for your in-home assessment would be things like school documents, IEPs, perhaps maybe a psych assessment, maybe regional center documents, perhaps if you have some ABA reports or maybe some third-party documentation, say from maybe doctors or from other therapies that your child engages in. You also have the ability to ask your child questions. Obviously the social worker is the individual that's conducting the assessment, but there is no reason why you can't ask your child questions that you know your child cannot answer appropriately in front of the social worker. Once again, the function of the assessment in terms of protective supervision, the function of the assessment is to demonstrate that your child has certain disabilities that would warrant the granting of protective supervision. And if you have the ability to demonstrate those during the assessment, well, that's the main purpose of the in-home assessment. So I'm going to give you an example of something that just occurred on an assessment I took part in 2 weeks ago. And this was an assessment in which it was a 12-year-old child, and the 12-year-old child was asked by the social worker if they knew how to use 911 or knew what 911 was. I think actually the question may have been, what would you do if there was a fire? And of course the appropriate response would be call 911. Well, the reality is most of our kiddos have been rotely taught in school that whenever this question comes up that they're supposed to respond with, call 911. So if you just simply go with the asking of the question and the response from the child, it might seem like the child understands the process of 911. But I'm going to ask you this question. Does your child know how to use a phone? So in this particular situation, I was on a Zoom call. It was a video, and the family actually had a phone in front of them. And the social worker, of course, asked the question of the child whether or not what they would do if there was a fire, and they responded, call 911. And so I asked for the child if they've ever ordered a pizza, because you cannot ask somebody to call 911. That's against the law, especially if they actually physically are successful in hitting the numbers and then the call goes through. that is technically a federal offense. So you don't want to actually use 911 when you do this. But what I did is I asked the child I asked them if they'd ever ordered a pizza before, because a lot of us order pizzas, and especially during the pandemic, I would think it's probably very typical for many of us to have, either through an app on your phone or from a phone number, have ordered food at some point. So it's a reasonable request of someone who's 12 years old. And so I asked this child to order pizza. And what came up in the exchange of trying to work the phone is that the child, even though they were able to rotely respond, call 911 if there was a fire, it became quickly apparent that the child did not use a phone. So even if there was, say for example, a fire in the house, and even if the child was rotely told dial 911 if there's an emergency, the child couldn't actually execute it due to a lack of mental functioning. And therefore it demonstrated that the child had, at least in terms of orientation, an inability to use a handheld device. And by having them actually demonstrate the practice of using the device versus just responding with a phrase, call 911, it clearly gave a different outcome to the social worker's assessment. I also want to remind everybody that when the social worker is at the house, you're not having tea with the social worker. That's not the function. You're not there to have a nice little get-together with somebody for 45 minutes while you complete paperwork. The function of the in-home assessment is to watch your child. And so, once again, just keep in mind when you're doing the in-home assessment that you want to make sure that whatever you do, you're taking steps to make sure that the social worker sees your child in a true light, not in a light in which your child is, for lack of better words, euthanized by a television or by a handheld device or by a tablet or whatever the comfort item is, in which will cause a child with a developmental disability to zone out and appear to be completely calm, even though when the social worker leaves an hour later, your child's going to be jumping all over the furniture and trying to run out the front door and banging his head and a variety of different behaviors. The idea is you want to have your child's behavior witnessed by your social worker. I watched a lot of cartoons when I was a kid, and there's one cartoon that has always resonated with me when I discuss this, and that would be, for those of you who are Warner Brothers Bugs Bunny fans, if you're familiar with the frog. In fact, the frog is the logo that's currently used by Warner Brothers Network. It's the dancing frog. It's got the little top hat and the little dancing stick. And in the cartoon, what happens is a regular guy finds the frog, and the frog is singing, show tunes. And the guy that finds the frog thinks, oh, I'm going to make $1 million because this is a frog that can sing and dance. And so he takes the frog and he tries to go as quickly as he can to a producer so that he can show the producer, hey, I've got this singing frog, thinking he's going to make a lot of money. And what ends up happening in the cartoon is he gets right to the producer, and the frog stops. And so when the producer comes in the room to see the frog, it's a typical frog that just ribbits. My point here is that you want to, if you can, you want to create a situation where the social worker sees your frog singing and dancing, not your frog ribbiting. What I mean by that is your child. If in fact you're concerned with your child, is certain behaviors, you want to make sure that those behaviors are behaviors that are witnessed, if you can, by your social worker. And you don't want to put your child in a situation where they're not going to engage in those behaviors. I state it this way because I've talked to parents on different occasions, and I have some parents that tell me that their child will act out if they watch television, that the behavior will escalate because of content on television. I have other parents that tell me their child will zone out if they watch television. So I can't say television by itself is either good or bad for your situation, but you as the parent would know if your child would act out by watching TV, or your child would zone out by watching TV. So just understand that the function here is for your social worker to see your child engaging in those behaviors that you think are concerning for protective supervision. And in the event that your child doesn't engage in those behaviors when their social worker is in the home, hopefully those behaviors have been witnessed in third-party documents. And so you can show your social worker that, your child has been witness to headbang at school, your child's been witness to elope at therapy programs, your child's been witness to engage in potentially self-injurious behavior in ABA reports. There's goals written for this stuff, whether it's in the IEP or whether it's in the ABA report. But you would, at this point, if the behavior is not something that's witnessed by the social worker at the assessment, this would clearly be something that you would want to identify in the documents. So, any questions?
Jasmine said that her social worker was only at the door for 5 to 10 minutes.
This was during COVID? Because that's going to be ending soon, I would think. Now that everything's loosening up, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of the in-home assessments. Another strategy that I have is videotaping your child, but not videotaping your child doing behavior. Videotaping your child answering questions. Another example from another client. I today witnessed a video of a 12-year-old child who was asked very simple questions like, what are the names of your closest relatives? What's your birthday? What's your address? And throughout the entire video, what I witnessed was a child just absolutely laughing. Couldn't focus whatsoever at all on anything except laughing, and the video was approximately 2 minutes long. And so what I got out of that video is that it was difficult to engage the child in any type of bona fide questioning, and that they had due to a mental impairment, they had an inability to focus in on the task at hand. And so to me that demonstrated whether it be as a result of a deficit in orientation or a deficit possibly in memory, maybe even judgment. It clearly showed that child had a lack of mental functioning. So in those events where you don't have a social worker that can view your child for a good period of time, yeah, you might want to try providing some type of video evidence that's not evidence of actual behavior, because the problem with actual behavior is if you're not showing yourself taking preventative action to stop the behavior, it looks like showboating, and you don't want to make it look like you're trying to stage something. Having your child sit at a table and they're completely calm and you're asking them questions and they're not answering the questions appropriately, that just establishes a lack of mental functioning. Any other questions?
Not right now. If anybody has questions, please type them in the comment section. Sound.
Nothing coming through?
Sarah said sound question mark resolved. I think she was having technical issues.
Okay.
So if anybody has questions for Larry, please type them in the comment section. We'll give it a minute or so. If not, then we're good to go. But
so I'm showing there's 27 people on right now.
yes, there are. Do you have any other tidbits of information you can provide while we're waiting for questions to come in?
In terms of the in-home assessment, I think the most important thing that families just need to understand is that they have the ability to control the flow of the assessment, not the social worker, and that the social worker's agenda is to make it as easy as possible for them. So if they can hand your child a handheld device, for example, and focus on paperwork, that makes their job much easier, and it creates a circumstance where your social worker is going to say, oh, the child was well behaved and blah blah blah, and in reality, if they weren't handed the phone or the tablet, or they weren't zoning in on the television, the behavior would be much more pronounced. The reality is that protective supervision is 24/7 supervision, and their social workers only seeing your child for a short period of time. And so if they impact, and I use the word negatively because I'm discussing an outcome in which the social worker is viewing a behavior that is distinctly different than the behavior that you're alleging. So if during that short period of time, if the outcome is where the social worker has a negative connotation of the need for protective supervision, that will negatively impact the outcome of the finding.
So I think Amy has more of a comment, but we had that exact situation when a social worker asked my daughter what to do in an emergency, and after several minutes of prompting, she finally answered call 911. We explained to the social worker that she would not use the phone, but the social worker responded that as long as she knew the answer, that was good enough.
I disagree.
Lorena says, do they look at how we lock our doors for safety and if knives, hazardous things are out of reach? Question.
Well, the thing about the locking of the doors is that CDSS has determined that locking a child in a room unattended is not a substitute for protective supervision. So whereas locks on the doors can reduce the likelihood of a child who, say, engages in elopement behavior, it can reduce the likelihood of the child getting out the front door. The reality is it's still a door. If they want it to be 100%, they should make it a wall, and that way the door never opens or closes. But the reality is it's still a door, and so there's still potential to get in and out. I know that I've had families who have deadbolts, and the deadbolts will actually effectively lock somebody out from the outside. So if you've got dad coming home from work and he can't get in the house because the deadbolt's on, well, that's not an effective door. Not only that, but I also know of other families that have initiated certain types of devices on the doors that would actually be considered to be fire hazards because it makes it so it's either difficult or impossible to get through the door if there's an emergency. So there has to be some common sense in regards to the determination as to whether or not a lock is as an environmental modification is a bona fide substitute for protective supervision. And as I stated, CDSS has indicated that locking somebody in a room unattended is not a substitute for protective supervision.
So Jasmine, the person who said that the social worker stood outside her door for 5 to 10 minutes, she just wanted to ask if she could ask for another assessment.
Did I take it the assessment didn't go well? Absolutely. Or appeal it, and when you go in front of the judge, you can explain to the judge, your side of things. That that this is why the social worker came up with the perception they came up with. The reality is until you actually go in front of a judge, the social worker can, and I know it's going to sound rough to say, but they can really do whatever they want because they've been given the authority to come in and do an in-home assessment, and it's not until after they either approve or deny that you have the ability to either say I agree with my social worker's determination or I disagree with my social worker's determination, at which point you file an administrative hearing. And so I've had many times where I've had social workers conduct assessments that I felt were inappropriate. I've had social workers who have denied without looking at doctor forms. I've had social workers who have, as you've stated, have come in and done very short assessments where they don't even have the child in the home when they've done the assessments. And so if you can identify where a social worker has done an inappropriate job of reviewing all of the available information in order to make a determination, yeah, you can certainly use that as a reason to ask a judge to reduce the evidentiary weight of whatever the social worker's opinion is. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm just trying to. So Naya said, great information. I'm interested in filing for IHSS for my kiddos, but think that I have to file for a regional center first. Is that correct? But then she also says my kiddos used to be with the regional center, but we're no longer clients when they turned 3.
So regional center is not a requirement for IHSS. It is a very good piece of evidence to have for getting protective supervision, but it's not required. And so you mentioned at age 3, Regional Center has what they call an early start program where they will provide services to children who are delayed up to the age of 3, and then at age 3 they'll reassess the child, and if the child continues to have the the qualifying needs to continue on with regional center, they'll continue you on. I don't know exactly what your regional center worker saw or didn't see when they did the reassessment at age 3, but if you believe that that is incorrect, you should ask regional center to, if it's not too late, ask them to review, possibly ask for a fair hearing to review the denial at age 3, or reapply again based upon a change in circumstances. But IHSS protective supervision is a separate program than regional center, and whereas having regional center is a very useful tool in helping to get protective supervision, it's not required.
Okay. Hope asked, if my son goes to community college with an aide, is that a reason social worker can take away protective supervision?
With an aide? No, I don't see why that would be a problem. Did that happen? Is she responding quickly?
Wait, my son has episodes of behavior and might not have anyone when social worker visits. What to do? It's the same lady. That's Hope.
Okay. So you're saying your child would have an episode in front of the social worker?
Let me get back to it. I'm sorry.
So I'm going to go back to one of the comments I made earlier. You're not having tea with your social worker. So just like if you were, at your home with anybody else, if your child were all of a sudden to engage in some type of behavior that would be inappropriate and potentially self-injurious, you excuse yourself from whatever that situation is and you go take care of your child. It's just that simple. And so the idea that you're concerned about your child engaging in inappropriate behavior when you're alone with your social worker, that's your social worker is obviously witnessing a situation in which your child is engaging in potentially dangerous behavior. That would be an ideal situation if you're trying to get protective supervision.
More questions coming. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Just give me a second. So Darlene says, so my son's worker said in position of statement he can call 911. No impairment. In home she asked him. It took him 3 tries in hitting 3 numbers. He responded, Mom and Dad. She says 911. And she says 911. Let me see if there's any more to that additional question on that one. So Christy, what if your child doesn't understand content but will repeat what they've been told over and over? Example, my son will tell you fire is hot because he's been told it so many times, but will touch fire because he doesn't understand it'll hurt him.
You just said it exactly the way you say it. You explained to the social worker that my child's been taught to say fire is hot, but that he will still touch the fire. The idea that your child, even though he touches fire one time, and then you tell him no, it's bad, that he goes back and continues to touch fire over and over again, is a sign that he doesn't have the mental capacity to learn, and that would actually affect both memory and possibly orientation. And so that's the kind of behavior that protective supervision is actually warranted for. Is this idea of an individual who has a lack of mental functioning to the extent that they will engage in potentially dangerous behavior, and that your supervision is required to make sure that you're safeguarding your child from engaging in those behaviors, and that you're close enough that in the event that your child does actually attempt to engage in the behavior, that you're able to stop them.
So a question from Claudia. Her son is almost 4 years old. He has ABA, OT, physical therapy, and speech. But in every therapy, his behavior is fine, but in ABA, he has behavior like hitting his head with wall, floor, or his own hands. But I don't think ABA has written this behaviors when it happened. Can I ask ABA to write this in his report?
Absolutely. In fact, I encourage you to do that. Absolutely. In fact, if anyone out there thinks their child might be engaging in behaviors at school that they're not reporting in the in the IEPs, call an emergency IEP and discuss it. Have a psychiatrist or psychologist observe your child in the classroom. You can ask for an individualized education evaluation, and typically they're very expensive if you use a third party. But if you're willing to work with your school and you're just asking for a third party that's related to the school, like a school psychologist, they're on staff and they'll be able to go in the classroom and observe your child probably over a duration of several weeks, several times over several weeks. And so if there are examples where your child is engaging in these behaviors, it'll come out during that evaluation.
So Darlene followed up with a clarification on her question. Social worker hinted to her son who to call an emergency, and she said it's 3 numbers. He replied, it's mom and dad, and then the social worker told him 911. Wouldn't this constitute that he didn't know it on his own?
Yes. Yes, it would. And age is a factor in a lot of the stuff. So if your child is, say, age 2, that's not something that a 2-year-old would be expected to know. A typical 2-year-old would be expected to know. But if your child's 12 and they don't know how 911, yeah, especially considering the fact your social worker is asking that question and the child is not responding appropriately, yeah, that would be an indication of a deficit in mental impairment.
So this question is for an adult. Lorna asks, is there any advice for applying for her adult son who's 31 and lives in his own apartment?
Applying for IHSS?
I'm assuming, yes.
I would just go through the process. I don't know anything about the child, so I can't say one way or the other. The one thing I will suggest for everybody is just make sure that you're honest and that you're using integrity when you go through this process. So you want documentation from whatever age 31. I'm not sure what you're going to have because you've already phased out of the school district. You might have a day program possibly. Maybe regional center is assisting with some programs. But maybe doctor forms might help. Certainly the best thing would be if you are concerned about a particular behavior and your 31-year-old child engages in that behavior when the social worker's in the house. That would be the most ideal scenario. Like I said, if you're going to make an argument that your child juggles, it's best that your social worker sees your child juggling. That's the best scenario.
Okay. So Veronica asks, should siblings be close by or in another room?
Siblings during an assessment?
Uh-huh.
I don't think that really matters. It's up to the parent to really make determinations on what's going to cause your child to act. What's what I'm looking for? You're concerned about a certain behavior or certain behaviors, and if in fact the presence of certain stimuli, whether it's a television or whether it's your siblings, is going to cause a reduction in that behavior, yeah, you might want to consider having the kids in another room, the siblings in another room.
That's all the questions that I see, unless I missed them, but I think we got all of them. Does anybody have any last minute questions for Larry? We'll give it a couple seconds if you're typing. Tim asked, what do you mean by juggling?
Juggling is a euphemism. I'm referring to any behavior that you're concerned about. So let's replace juggling with headbanging, just for simplicity's sake. So let's say that you're concerned because your child bangs his head. So banging your head. But it could be, I use juggling because it can be replaced with anything. Any behavior under the sun that you're concerned about.
So Jasmine, I think Larry, you already answered this for her. She asked if she should ask for another assessment. And this is the one the social worker is standing outside the door for
Yeah.
5-10 minutes.
I would file a hearing request, and if in fact the judge makes a determination that there was not enough evidence to reach a determination, the judge may order another assessment. That's a possibility. But certainly file a hearing request if you have a denial and you're still within your 90-day period.
Okay, any more questions?
If you have questions after this Facebook Live event, you're welcome to reach out to us. You can go to IHSSadvocates.com. Most of you probably are familiar with the IHSS advocacy group because that's where it's one of the primary locations that we post on the Facebook Live events. So if you go in there, there's many different ways you can contact either us as a group or Shirley individually, and we're happy to answer questions that you have for us. So with that, thank you very much, everybody.